The European theater in the winter of 1944 was a landscape defined by the brutal and compromising physics of mass and friction. An American armored division was an industrial leviathan of staggering proportions, requiring thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and hundreds of tons of daily supplies just to exist in the field. When an entity of that sheer physical weight moved, it scarred the earth. It crushed the rural roads of France and Belgium into impassable ribbons of mud. It filled the frozen air with the deafening roar of radial engines and the aggressive clanking of steel tracks, and it saturated the electromagnetic spectrum with a chaotic symphony of radio traffic. For the intelligence officers of the German High Command, specifically the analysts of the Fremde Heer West, tracking the Allied advance was largely a matter of applied mathematics and observation. The German military intelligence apparatus had spent years perfecting the art of signals intelligence, radio direction finding, and aerial reconnaissance. They operated sophisticated listening posts known as E-Dienst stations, which systematically vacuumed up Allied radio transmissions, triangulating the sources to map the exact locations of American divisions. They understood the logistical footprint of their enemies so thoroughly that they could predict major offensives simply by analyzing the volume of radio traffic or the density of vehicle tracks captured in a brief reconnaissance photograph. The laws of warfare dictated that an army could not simply vanish. Mass could not be hidden, and a division consisting of 15,000 men could not teleport across the battlefield. Yet as the war ground toward the heavily fortified borders of the German homeland, the maps on the tables of the Wehrmacht High Command began to fail them in ways that defied rational military explanation. Entire American corps would seemingly anchor themselves in a specific sector, projecting all the overwhelming auditory, visual, and electromagnetic signatures of a massive buildup, locking the German defensive reserves into rigid defensive postures. Then, without warning and with impossible speed, those exact same American forces would cross a river or breach a defensive line 40 miles away, leaving the German intelligence officers staring at completely contradictory data. The reality of how the American military achieved this impossible manipulation of time, space, and mass was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Second World War. The German army was not fighting teleporting divisions, they were fighting a meticulously engineered multi-sensory phantom created by a highly classified unit officially designated as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but known in whispered rumors simply as the Ghost Army. The inception of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops represented a radical departure from traditional military doctrine. While the vast majority of the American military-industrial complex was focused on producing heavier armor, larger artillery, and faster aircraft, a small group of strategic planners in the War Department realized that the sheer size of the Allied army made it incredibly predictable. To inject chaos and uncertainty into the German intelligence network, they needed a unit capable of simulating the full spectrum signature of a massive fighting force without actually possessing the combat power. The War Department did not recruit this special unit from the standard infantry training camps. Instead, they combed the art schools, advertising agencies, theaters, and sound studios of New York and Hollywood. They drafted architects, set designers, audio engineers, painters, and actors. These were men who understood the psychology of perception, who knew how to manipulate light, sound, and shadow to create a convincing reality. When they were brought together at Camp Forest in Tennessee, they were stripped of their civilian identities and forged into a heavily compartmentalized unit consisting of barely 1,100 men. Their singular mission was to project the illusion of 30,000 men, and they were equipped with an arsenal unlike anything ever deployed on a battlefield. The foundation of their deception relied on a four-pillar strategy encompassing visual, sonic, radio, and atmospheric manipulation. The visual deception was the responsibility of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. To fool the high-altitude cameras of the Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes, the 603rd deployed a vast armada of pneumatic decoys. The masterpiece of their arsenal was the inflatable M4 Sherman tank. Constructed from precisely cut panels of neoprene rubber fabric, these dummy tanks were engineered to perfectly replicate the silhouette dimensions and shadow profile of a real 30-ton Sherman. Deflated, the rubber tank weighed a mere 93 pounds and could be folded tightly into a canvas duffel bag, allowing a single soldier to carry a weapon of war that normally required a heavy transport trailer. When connected to a specialized portable air compressor, the rubber envelope would aggressively expand, locking into a rigid shape, complete with a dummy 75mm gun barrel suspended by internal tension wires. But the artists of the 603rd understood that a perfect rubber tank sitting pristine in a field would instantly arouse suspicion. Aerial reconnaissance analysts were trained to look for the messy realities of warfare. Therefore, the visual deception had to be deliberately flawed. The engineers would partially drape the pneumatic tanks in genuine camouflage netting, knowing that the human brain, when perceiving something that is intentionally hidden, instinctively assumes that the hidden object is valuable and real. Furthermore, a rubber tank leaves no tracks. To complete the terrestrial illusion, the 23rd deployed heavily modified bulldozers to aggressively tear up the earth around the inflatable vehicles, carving deep, violent ruts into the mud that perfectly mimicked the mechanical churning of a real armored column maneuvering into a fighting position. They would systematically create dummy artillery emplacements complete with piles of empty wooden shell casings and intentionally scorch the earth in front of the rubber muzzles to simulate the blast marks of heavy howitzers. From an altitude of 10,000 feet, the optical illusion was flawless. The German analysts poring over the reconnaissance photographs saw exactly what they were trained to see: a massive American armored formation digging in for a protracted assault. However, visual deception alone was insufficient. In the fog and perpetual overcast of the European winter, visibility was often reduced to meta yards. The German army relied heavily on acoustic intelligence, using highly sensitive listening devices and the trained ears of forward observers to gauge the size and intent of the American forces across the front line. To counter this, the War Department established the 3132 Signal Service Company, a unit dedicated entirely to the weaponization of sound. The technology they wielded was the absolute bleeding edge of acoustic engineering, developed in total secrecy in the laboratories of the Bell Telephone Company. The engineers at Bell had perfected the wire recorder, a precursor to magnetic tape that could capture high-fidelity audio on a spool of incredibly thin steel wire. In the months leading up to the deployment of the Ghost Army, audio engineers traveled to the armored training grounds at Fort Knox, Kentucky, capturing thousands of hours of raw acoustic data. They recorded the distinct high-pitched whine of a Sherman tank traversing its turret, the violent mechanical grinding of gears shifting under heavy load, the deep resonant thud of artillery batteries firing in sequence, the chaotic rumbling of heavy supply trucks navigating muddy roads, and the ambient background noise of thousands of infantrymen building a bivouac, complete with coughing, shouting, and the clatter of mess kits. These isolated acoustic elements were brought back to the studio and meticulously mixed and layered onto specialized wire spools, creating incredibly dense and realistic audio landscapes. To project this fabricated reality across the battlefield, the 3132 mounted massive custom-built 500-watt amplifiers and heavy directional speaker arrays onto the back of M3 armored half-tracks. These acoustic projection vehicles were essentially mobile concert stages capable of blasting the sounds of an entire armored division across miles of hostile territory. The deployment of the sonic half-tracks was an exact science. The engineers had to account for the complex physics of sound propagation over varied terrain. They studied meteorological reports, knowing that a temperature inversion on a cold European night would trap the low-frequency rumbles of the recorded tank engines close to the earth, allowing the sound to travel up to 15 miles through the dense, damp air. When the 3132 initiated a sonic deception program, they did not simply play a continuous loop of noise. They orchestrated a dynamic acoustic narrative. They would start by playing the sounds of heavy engineering equipment clearing roads, then layer in the approach of heavy transport trucks, followed by the distinct sounds of armored vehicles moving into position, and finally the ambient noise of a massive encampment settling down for the night. To the German soldiers shivering in their trenches on the opposite side of the river, the auditory evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. They could hear the mechanical screams of American armor massing in the darkness directly in front of them, completely unaware that they were listening to a phantom projected from a handful of wire spools. Yet the most critical and highly sophisticated element of the Ghost Army operation was the manipulation of the electromagnetic spectrum executed by the Signal Company Special. The German IDEST radio interception network was arguably the most efficient and dangerous intelligence gathering apparatus in the European theater. They did not need to break the American cryptographic codes to glean actionable intelligence. They relied on traffic analysis. By monitoring the volume of radio transmissions, the frequencies used, and the specific rhythmic signatures of individual Morse code operators, they could map the entire American command structure. Every radio operator possessed a unique cadence and timing when tapping out Morse code, a physical rhythm known in signal intelligence as a fist. The German analysts had catalogued the fists of the key radio operators in every major American division, tracking them across the continent like electronic fingerprints. The men of the Signal Company Special were elite radio operators whose specific job was to steal those fingerprints. When a real American division was slated to secretly relocate, the Ghost Army radio operators would integrate themselves into the genuine unit's command post. They would sit beside the real operators, listening to their specific rhythm, their speed, their pauses, and their idiosyncratic mistakes. They would learn to perfectly mimic the electronic personality of the men they were replacing. When the real division finally pulled out under the cover of absolute darkness and radio silence, the Ghost Army operators would seamlessly take over their transmitters. They would begin passing massive volumes of fabricated radio traffic, perfectly mimicking the cryptographic protocols, the call signs, and most importantly the unique physical fists of the departed operators. To the German listening posts miles away, the electromagnetic picture remained perfectly static. The E-Dienst triangulated the signals, confirming that the American command structure was exactly where it had been the day before. The combination of visual, acoustic, and electromagnetic deception was bound together by a fourth layer of physical atmospherics. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were fundamentally actors performing on the most dangerous stage in the world. When they moved into an area to impersonate a specific unit such as the 97th Infantry Division or the 2nd Armored Division, they would sew the genuine shoulder patches of those units onto their uniforms. They would paint the specific bumper codes and unit designations of the impersonated division onto their own transport trucks and jeeps. They would establish heavily guarded military police checkpoints at critical road intersections, stopping civilian traffic and local residents, ensuring that any embedded German spies or informants operating in the area would observe exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to see. They would order convoys of 2 or 3 empty heavy transport trucks to drive in continuous endless loops through the cobblestone streets of small French and Belgian villages, with the few men sitting in the back instructed to shout, sing, and make as much noise as possible. To the locals observing through shuttered windows, it appeared as though an endless stream of reinforcements was pouring into the sector. All of these incredibly complex layers of deception were brought together in highly synchronized tactical performances known as operations. The ultimate validation of the Ghost Army concept and the clearest explanation of how the American forces seemingly vanished and reappeared 40 miles away occurred in March of 1945 during the build-up to the massive Allied crossing of the Rhine River under the operational designation of Operation Biersen. The Rhine was the final great natural barrier defending the German heartland. The 9th United States Army under the command of General William Simpson was tasked with crossing the massive river, an operation that required extraordinary mass and violence. The German High Command anticipated the crossing and had positioned their remaining heavy reserves, including artillery batteries and elite panzer units, along the eastern bank, waiting to crush the Americans as they attempted to bridge the fast-flowing water. General Simpson realized that if he launched a frontal assault against a prepared German defense, the casualties would be catastrophic. He needed to shift the immense weight of his actual assault force, primarily the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, roughly 40 miles to the north, to a crossing point where the German defenses were significantly weaker. But moving 2 entire divisions along the front line without the Germans noticing was a logistical impossibility. Every truck engine, every radio transmission, and every movement would be detected by the hyper-vigilant German intelligence network, resulting in the German reserves simply shadowing the American movement parallel to the river. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were ordered to execute the most dangerous and expansive illusion of the war. They were tasked with stepping directly into the trenches and bivouacs of the 30th and 79th Divisions, adopting their entire physical and electromagnetic identity, allowing the real combat forces to vanish. The operation began under the cover of a thick, freezing darkness. The real infantrymen and tank crews of the 30th and 79th Divisions received absolute blackout orders. They taped down any loose gear that might rattle, muffled their engine exhausts, and began a massive, agonizingly slow withdrawal, moving 40 miles north in complete radio silence. As the last genuine combat elements slipped out of the sector, the 1,100 men of the 23rd moved in seamlessly, filling the massive physical void left by 30,000 heavily armed troops. The choreography of the handover was a masterpiece of military deception. As the real Sherman tanks rolled backward out of their protective dirt scrapes, the men of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers immediately rushed forward, dragging their heavy canvas duffel bags. In the freezing mud, they unrolled the pneumatic rubber tanks attaching the air compressors. Within minutes, a completely fake armored battalion inflated into existence, perfectly occupying the exact physical footprint of the departed armor. They threw camouflage netting over the rubber hulls and scattered empty ration tins and fuel cans around the sites to complete the visual narrative. Simultaneously, the radio operators of the signal company Special took control of the entire communication network. The real radio operators had gone silent, but the airwaves did not die. The Ghost Army operators instantly began transmitting a massive volume of dummy traffic, discussing fake logistical problems, requesting non-existent artillery barrages, and mimicking the exact Morse code rhythms of the men who were currently driving 40 miles to the north. Across the river, the German Dienst intercept stations eagerly soaked up the transmissions, mapping the exact locations of the American command posts, confirming to the German generals that the 30th and 79th Divisions were firmly entrenched and preparing to cross the river directly in front of them. As the sun began to rise, burning off the morning fog, the 3132 Signal Service Company unleashed the auditory component of the illusion. The massive directional speakers mounted on the half-tracks roared to life, projecting the deafening mechanical symphony of thousands of vehicles, shifting gears, heavy bridging equipment being unloaded, and the chaotic shouts of men preparing for a massive assault. The sound waves rolled across the Rhine, physically vibrating the cold air, convincing the German forward observers that an apocalyptic attack was imminent. The psychological pressure on the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops during Operation Viersen was nearly incomprehensible. They were fundamentally a theatrical troop stranded on the very edge of the deadliest conflict in human history. They were sitting a few hundred yards away from battle-hardened German infantry and heavy artillery batteries, separated only by the fast-moving water of the Rhine. If the German intelligence officers managed to see through the illusion, if a single Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane flew low enough to realize the tanks were made of rubber and canvas, or if the German Dienst analysts detected a flaw in the cryptographic spoofing, the German army would have launched a massive preemptive artillery strike or a swift armored counterattack. The Ghost Army possessed absolutely no heavy weapons. They had no real tanks, no anti-tank guns, and no heavy artillery to defend themselves. Their only defense was the absolute perfection of the lie they were telling. They were forced to sit in the mud, entirely exposed, relying purely on the belief that the German army was more afraid of the phantom they had created than the reality of their vulnerability. The illusion held with devastating efficiency. The German High Command fully, completely, and utterly believed the false data being fed into their intelligence network. They firmly anchored their heavy defensive reserves and artillery batteries directly opposite the positions held by the Ghost Army, waiting for an attack that would never come. They even began indiscriminately shelling the empty woods and the pneumatic rubber tanks, wasting incredibly precious high-explosive ammunition on targets filled with nothing but pressurized air. Meanwhile, 40 miles to the north, the genuine fighting elements of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions arrived at their actual crossing points entirely undetected. Because the German intelligence apparatus was completely fixated on the electromagnetic and acoustic phantoms projected by the Ghost Army, the northern sector was drastically undefended. When the real American assault forces finally launched their amphibious crossing across the Rhine River, they were met with shockingly light resistance. The complex pontoon bridges were constructed with unprecedented speed, and the American armor poured across the river into the German heartland, shattering the final defensive line of the Third Reich. When the German officers operating in that sector were eventually captured and interrogated by Allied intelligence, their profound confusion perfectly encapsulated the absolute success of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The German commanders were fundamentally incapable of explaining the physics of their defeat. They showed their meticulously plotted intelligence maps to their American captors, pointing to the heavily concentrated radio signals, the documented vehicle tracks, and the confirmed acoustic reports locating the American army 40 miles to the south. They demanded to know the mechanical specifications of the impossible American transport system that had allowed an entire armored corps to vanish from a heavily monitored static position and instantaneously materialize on their exposed flank without leaving a single trace on the electromagnetic spectrum or the physical roads. They could not process the reality that the flawless intelligence they had gathered over the preceding days, the radio intercepts, the acoustic telemetry, and the visual reconnaissance, was nothing more than a highly orchestrated theatrical performance designed by artists and sound engineers. The tactical application of deception by the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops fundamentally rewired the reality of the European battlefield. By completely dominating the information space, they weaponized the German army's own reliance on intelligence against them. The German High Command was exceptionally competent at analyzing data, but they were conceptually unprepared for the possibility that the data itself was a meticulously constructed lie. The Ghost Army operated in absolute secrecy, participating in more than 20 distinct battlefield deceptions, moving up and down the front lines from Normandy to the Rhine River, continuously adopting new identities, projecting the illusion of massive force, and deliberately drawing the attention of the German war machine away from the actual points of Allied vulnerability. They defended dangerously overextended lines during the Battle of the Bulge, holding open gaps in the American defensive perimeter by projecting the acoustic and radio signatures of heavy armor, terrifying the advancing German columns into halting their advance to prepare for an armored engagement with a phantom force that did not exist. The sheer scale of the deception required a level of operational security so absolute that the very existence of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops remained a highly classified government secret for decades after the conclusion of the war. The men who had orchestrated the most successful tactical illusions in military history returned to their civilian lives as artists, architects, and engineers, completely unable to speak about their critical role in dismantling the German defensive strategy. The legacy of their operations proved that modern warfare was no longer solely decided by the brutal arithmetic of industrial production, the thickness of armor plating, or the destructive yield of heavy artillery. It demonstrated with terrifying clarity that the most powerful weapon on the battlefield was the manipulation of human perception. By controlling what the enemy saw, what they heard, and what they intercepted on the radio, the 1,100 men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops repeatedly outmaneuvered the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world, proving that an army constructed of rubber canvas and sound waves could inflict as much strategic devastation as an army forged from steel and high explosives, leaving a trail of shattered intelligence networks and profoundly confused enemy commanders in their wake as they silently dismantled the European theater, one perfectly executed illusion at a time. The physical mechanics of their operations required a continuous and exhausting cycle of creation and destruction. As soon as a deception operation achieved its strategic objective and the real combat units had safely completed their maneuvers, the Ghost Army had to meticulously erase their own existence. Under the cover of darkness, the 603rd Camouflage Engineers would rush back into the fields, opening the heavy brass valves on the pneumatic Sherman tanks, listening to the sharp hiss of escaping compressed air as the massive rubber structures collapsed back into heavy lifeless folds of fabric. The massive sonic amplifiers on the half-tracks would be powered down, plunging the entire sector back into the stark, terrifying silence of a genuine combat zone. The radio operators of the Signal Company Special would transmit a final sequence of perfectly spoofed Morse code, deliberately orchestrating the false electromagnetic narrative of a division quietly standing down before cutting the power to their transmitters, leaving the German listening posts staring at an empty void of static. Everything, the rubber tanks, the massive reels of wire recordings, the counterfeit shoulder patches, and the specialized air compressors, was furiously packed away onto the transport trucks before the morning light could expose the theatrical nature of the bivouac. The convoy would then drive endlessly through the scarred landscape of Europe, navigating the chaotic logistics of the Allied advance, seeking out the next critical point of strategic vulnerability where the theater of war required them to construct another impossible phantom. The psychological endurance required to sustain this relentless cycle of high-stakes deception was immense. The men of the 23rd were constantly living in the shadow of overwhelming enemy force, fully aware that any minor failure in their performance, any incorrectly painted bumper code, any out-of-sequence radio transmission, or any incorrectly positioned camouflage net could instantly shatter the illusion and draw a catastrophic barrage of high-explosive artillery fire down upon their completely unprotected positions. Yet they operated with a level of artistic precision and technical mastery that completely subverted the rigid analytical doctrines of the German military intelligence apparatus. They transformed the frozen battlefields of Europe into a massive canvas for psychological warfare, proving that the ultimate disruption of the enemy command structure was achieved not by blinding them but by providing them with perfectly constructed, flawlessly executed and completely fabricated realities, ensuring that the German army was constantly reacting to shadows, continually defending against phantoms, and utterly incapable of explaining how the crushing weight of the American military machine seemed to vanish into the thin winter air only to violently reappear precisely where they were least expected.